Hello and welcome to another quiet journey through time. Tonight we're traveling not to ancient ruins or distant empires, but to a moment much closer, just 27 years ago, when winter held the modern world in its frozen grip. It's a story about ice and darkness, about the fragility of everything we take for granted. It's about ordinary people who found themselves living through something extraordinary, not with violence or drama, but with the slow, steady weight of nature's patience. The great ice storm of 1998 lasted only days, but it changed millions of lives. It transformed the landscape into something alien and beautiful, something that shouldn't exist in the modern world. For those who lived through it, the storm became a dividing line. Life before and life after. Before, electricity was invisible, taken for granted, always there when you reached for a switch. After, every light that turned on felt like a small miracle. Every warm room became something to appreciate rather than expect. Tonight, we'll walk through that frozen world together. We'll feel what it was like to live without power for weeks, to watch trees turn to glass, to discover that civilization is far more fragile than anyone imagined. We'll meet the workers who fought exhaustion and ice to restore the grid. We'll explore forests transformed into cathedrals of light and destruction. We'll witness how the storm erased the distance between rich and poor, revealing that when nature decides to remind us of our smallness, comfort and privilege offer little protection. But before we drift into this luminous, frozen world together, I have a gentle request. If this quiet exploration speaks to you, if you're ready to wander back through that strange winter with me, perhaps you'd touch that like button, a small gesture that tells me you're here, listening in the darkness. Consider subscribing to Epic Boring History so these late-night passages through forgotten moments can find you again, week after week, guiding you toward rest. And if you'd like, leave a comment below. Tell me where you are right now, what city, what country, what time of day or night. Some of you may be wrapped in the deep stillness of 3 a.m., while others are just beginning your morning with coffee and soft light. Some are in between, in that twilight hour when the world feels suspended. Wherever you are, you're welcome here in this quiet space we're creating together. Now, if you can, dim the lights around you. Maybe switch on a fan for that gentle, constant hum that helps your mind release its grip on the day. Let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow, and prepare to step back into January 1998, when the world turned to glass and everything stopped. It's January 1998 and you live somewhere in upstate New York, perhaps near Watertown or close to the Canadian border, where the land stretches flat and white beneath endless grey skies. Your town is small, the kind of place where everyone knows the mail carrier's name. The winters here are always harsh, always long, but you're used to that. The cold is just part of life this far north. This winter feels different, though. It started with rain, which was odd for January, when everything should be frozen solid. The rain fell steadily, persistently, but it wasn't normal rain. When it touched anything, trees, power lines, roads, cars, it froze instantly, building up in layers. At first, it seemed beautiful. The trees glittered in the weak daylight, coated in a thin shell of ice that caught and refracted every bit of available light. Your neighbors remarked on how pretty everything looked, like the world had been dipped in glass. Children tried to skate on the sidewalks before their parents called them back inside, but the rain didn't stop. It continued through the first night, through the next day, through another night. With each passing hour, the ice grew thicker. Branches that had merely sparkled now bowed under the weight, creaking and groaning like old ships in a storm. On the second night, you woke to a sound you'd never heard before, a sharp crack, like a gunshot, followed by a tremendous crash. A tree in your neighbor's yard had split down the middle, its upper half collapsing onto their garage. You went to your window and looked out at a world transformed into something alien. Every surface gleamed with ice, and the streetlight cast strange shadows through the crystalline coating on everything. That's when you noticed the streetlight was flickering. It stuttered, dimmed, then went dark completely, leaving your street in sudden, total blackness. Inside your house, the lights went out a moment later. The refrigerator's constant hum ceased, and in its absence, you became aware of how much noise modern life makes, all of it suddenly completely gone. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive, like a held breath that wouldn't release. You fumbled for a flashlight in the dark, your hands clumsy with cold and surprise. When you found it and clicked it on, the beam seemed small and inadequate, swallowed by the darkness around you. The power would come back soon, you thought. It always did, a few hours at most, maybe overnight if the damage was serious. But morning came with no power, and the temperature in your house had already begun to drop. The furnace, you realized, needed electricity to run, even though it burned gas. By midday, you could see your breath inside your own home. That's when the reality began to settle in. This wasn't a normal outage, and it might not be fixed quickly. You turned on the battery-powered radio, the old one you kept in the basement for emergencies. The announcer's voice crackled through static, and you heard the first estimates, hundreds of thousands without power, maybe millions, across New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and into Canada. The freezing rain was still falling. More trees were coming down every hour, taking power lines with them. Crews were working, the announcer said, but the damage was extensive. Restoration could take days, possibly longer in rural areas. Days. You looked around your cold house and tried to imagine days without heat, without light, without the invisible infrastructure that made modern life possible. You put on another sweater, then another. Socks, 2 pairs, then 3. A hat, even though you were inside your own home. The kitchen faucet yielded water when you turned it, but it was ice cold. The water heater, like everything else, was dead. You filled pots and containers, unsure whether the pipes would freeze next. Outside, the world continued its transformation. The ice kept building, adding weight to every surface with patient, relentless accumulation. You could hear trees breaking in the distance, sometimes close by, sometimes far away. A constant soundtrack of slow destruction. Each crack was followed by that peculiar sound of ice cascading through branches, tinkling like wind chimes made of glass. Your neighbor from across the street appeared on your porch around noon. His face was red with cold, eyes worried beneath his wool cap. He asked if you had power, though of course you didn't, no one did. He wondered if you wanted to pool resources, maybe set up in one house together to conserve heat. You talked through the options. His house was smaller, easier to keep warm with a camping stove or candles, but your house had a fireplace, non-functional because you'd never bothered to have the chimney cleaned, but theoretically useful. In the end, you decided to wait one more day, hoping the power would return and make the question moot. He left, shuffling carefully across the ice-slicked ground, and you watched him disappear back into his dark house. The street, normally busy with cars and activity, was completely empty, completely silent. That afternoon, you attempted to drive to the store for supplies. Your car started, but the driveway was impossible, a steep slope coated in 2 inches of solid ice. The wheels spun uselessly, finding no traction. After 10 minutes of trying different angles and approaches, you gave up and went back inside, colder and more worried than before. If you couldn't drive, you were trapped here with whatever supplies you already had. You inventoried your pantry, some canned goods, pasta, rice, peanut butter, half a loaf of bread. The food in your refrigerator would be fine. The whole house was essentially a refrigerator now. But the food in the freezer was beginning to thaw despite the cold, because the temperature inside hovered just above freezing. You cooked everything you could on the camping stove, using precious fuel to prepare meals you could eat cold later. The small blue flame was hypnotic, one of the only sources of warmth in the entire house. As evening approached, the temperature inside dropped further. You guessed it was around 45 degrees, maybe colder, in the bedrooms upstairs. You gathered every blanket you owned and created a nest on the living room couch. This would be your sleeping spot, staying in one room, minimizing the space you needed to keep marginally warm. The candles you lit provided minimal heat, but enormous psychological comfort. Their flickering light pushed back against the darkness just enough to make you feel less alone. The radio became your companion, your connection to a world beyond your cold house. You listened to reports of the storm's progress, of emergency shelters opening, of roads closed and trees down, and power restoration efforts underway, but overwhelmed. The announcer read the names of towns, and you listened for yours. When he mentioned it, power outages continuing, no estimated restoration time, your stomach tightened with anxiety. That night, wrapped in blankets on your couch, you listened to the storm continue. The freezing rain tapped against the windows with patient persistence. Every half hour or so, another tree would crack and fall, the sound carrying clearly through the cold air. You found yourself flinching at each one, wondering if the next would hit your house. Sleep came in brief intervals, interrupted by cold and worry and the strange sounds of a world breaking under the weight of ice. You dreamed of summer, of heat and light, but woke shivering into darkness. Morning brought no improvement. The rain had finally stopped, but the damage was done. The world outside your window looked like a battlefield where nature had fought civilization and won. Telephone poles leaned at impossible angles. Some snapped entirely. Power lines sagged to the ground in useless loops. Your neighbor's oak tree, which had stood for longer than anyone could remember, had split down its center. One half still stood, barely, while the other sprawled across his lawn like a fallen giant. You ventured outside, moving slowly across ice, so slick you had to shuffle rather than walk. The air was bitterly cold, well below freezing now, and it burned in your lungs with each breath. Everything looked beautiful and terrible at once. The trees were sculptures of ice, each branch perfectly preserved in its glassy coating. When the sun broke through the clouds briefly, weakly, the entire landscape erupted in light. Every surface became a prism, throwing rainbows in all directions. It was the most beautiful thing you'd ever seen. It was also a disaster, a catastrophe, a demonstration of nature's power that made you feel small and helpless. You tried your cell phone, but the towers were down or overwhelmed. No signal, no way to call family and tell them you were okay. The isolation was profound. You were cut off not just from power and heat, but from connection, from the invisible web of communication that usually made distance irrelevant. Back inside, you ate peanut butter from the jar and crackers that had gone soft in the humidity. It was breakfast, or maybe lunch. Time had begun to lose meaning without clocks, without the structured rhythm of normal days. The camping stove had limited fuel. You rationed it carefully, using it only to melt snow for drinking water. Snow was plentiful outside, though getting to it required navigating the treacherous ice. You filled a pot, brought it inside, and watched it slowly melt over the blue flame. The resulting water was cold and tasted slightly of the pot's metal, but it was clean and necessary. You drank it slowly, grateful for this small thing you could control. By the third day, a strange acceptance had settled over you. This was your life now, cold, dark, disconnected. The shock had worn off, replaced by a kind of grim determination. You would endure this because there was no alternative. You established routines to give structure to the shapeless days. Wake when light appeared in the windows. Eat something cold, listen to the radio for updates. Melt snow for water. Walk carefully around the house, keeping your blood moving to stay warm. Eat something else. Light candles as darkness fell. Try to sleep under all the blankets you owned, fully clothed, hat pulled low over your ears. The routines were comforting in their predictability, even if the overall situation remained dire. Your neighbor appeared again, this time with another family from down the street. They decided to pool resources and set up in the house with the wood stove, someone 3 doors down who actually heated with wood every winter. They invited you to join them. You hesitated, reluctant to leave your own space, but the cold was becoming dangerous, and community seemed like the only sensible option. You packed a bag with clothes and blankets, moving slowly through your frozen house. On impulse, you took a family photo from the mantel, not sure why it seemed important, but unable to leave it behind. The walk to the other house took 10 minutes of careful shuffling across ice. The family there welcomed everyone with quiet nods, no smiles, just the shared understanding of people in crisis. Inside, a wood stove burned with blessed warmth. The house smelled of smoke and too many people in close quarters, but it was warm, genuinely, beautifully warm. You stood near the stove, hands extended toward the heat, and felt your frozen fingers begin to tingle and ache as feeling returned. That ache was painful, but also wonderful, a reminder that your body still worked, still responded, still lived. The group established a system, rotating watch to keep the fire going, shared meals from pooled supplies, quiet conversations in the candlelight about the storm, about the restoration efforts, about when normal life might return. No one knew the answer to that last question, but asking it gave everyone something to hope for. Days blurred together. The power stayed off, 4 days, 5 days a week. The radio reported that some areas were being restored, but rural regions like yours were low priority. The main cities needed power first, hospitals and shelters, and only then would crews reach the scattered houses in the countryside. You tried not to feel bitter about that. The logic made sense, even if it meant your suffering continued while others got relief. The group dynamics shifted over time. Initial politeness gave way to small tensions. Who did more work? Who ate more food? Who took up more space near the stove? But mostly people were kind. The crisis had stripped away pretense and social facades, leaving only the basic human need to survive and to help others survive. An elderly woman in the group told stories about her childhood, about living through the Depression, about what real hardship looked like. Her stories gave perspective. This was difficult, yes, but people had endured worse, for longer. A young couple with a toddler kept the child entertained, with songs and games played by candlelight. The child's laughter, rare but precious, reminded everyone that joy still existed somewhere beyond the cold and dark. On the 8th day, someone heard a rumor from a passing snowplow driver. Crews were working their way into the rural areas. Power might be restored within days. The group received this news with cautious hope. They'd been disappointed before. But 2 days later, at dusk, someone shouted that they'd seen lights in the distance. Everyone rushed to the windows, looking toward town. There, faint but unmistakable, streetlights glowing in the gathering darkness. Power had reached the edge of town. The emotion was overwhelming. Several people cried quietly, exhausted with relief. That night, no one slept much. Everyone listened for the sound of trucks, for any sign that the crews were getting closer. Morning came, and around noon you heard it, the distant hum of a bucket truck, the sound of people working, voices calling to each other in the cold air. The crews had arrived. By evening, your street was active with workers, linemen climbing poles, inspecting damage, splicing lines. You watched from the window, amazed by their efficiency, their calm competence in the face of destruction. And then, As the sun set on your 10th day without power, the lights came on. First one house, then another, then yours. The sudden illumination was shocking. Every light in your house blazed at once. You'd left them on days ago, expecting them to work, forgetting to turn them off. You walked from room to room, flipping switches off and on again, just to confirm it was real. The refrigerator hummed to life, and you nearly laughed at how beautiful that simple mechanical sound seemed. The furnace kicked in, sending warm air through the vents. You stood over a register with your hands extended, feeling that first wave of heat, and felt tears sting your eyes. That night, you returned to your own house. It felt enormous after days crowded with others, and also terribly empty. You took a hot shower, the first in 10 days, and stood under the water until it ran cold. You slept in your own bed, under your own blankets, in a room that was actually warm, and it felt like the most luxurious experience of your entire life. The storm was over. Power had returned, roads were being cleared, life would resume its normal patterns. But something had changed in those days of darkness and cold. You'd learned that everything you took for granted, heat, light, water, connection, could vanish in an instant. You'd learned that modern comfort was far more fragile than you'd ever imagined. And you'd learned that when everything fails, what remains is community, resilience, and the basic human capacity to endure. The great ice storm of 1998 lasted 10 days in your world, but its lessons, its impact, its memory, those would last much longer. His name was Robert Delaney, though everyone who worked with him called him Bob. He was 38 years old in January 1998, with a wife named Marie, 2 children, and a modest house in Saint-Hyacinthe, Quebec. Bob worked as a lineman for Hydro-Quebec, one of thousands of men and women who maintained the vast electrical grid that powered the province. His job was routine most days: drive to a location, inspect equipment, make repairs, file reports, go home. He'd been doing this work for 15 years, and in that time he'd developed a deep respect for electricity. It was invisible, powerful, dangerous, and absolutely essential to modern life. Most people never thought about the grid, never considered the infrastructure that brought power to their homes. Bob thought about it constantly. It was his job, his responsibility, his pride. The morning of January the 5th began like any other winter morning. Bob woke at 5:30, showered, dressed in his insulated coveralls and heavy boots. Marie was already in the kitchen making coffee. She kissed him goodbye at the door, the same ritual they'd performed thousands of times. The drive to the depot was uneventful. The roads were wet with rain, unusual for January, but not unheard of when temperatures hovered near freezing. At the morning briefing, the supervisor mentioned the weather. Freezing rain was forecast with potential for ice accumulation on the lines. Several crews would be on standby, monitoring the system for problems. Bob's team was assigned to the eastern region, a mix of suburban neighborhoods and rural farmland. They drove out in the bucket truck, Bob and 2 other linemen, listening to dispatch updates on the radio. The rain continued steadily, coating everything in a thin glaze. By mid-morning, reports started coming in. Branches were bowing under ice weight, and a few lines were sagging lower than normal. Bob's team inspected several locations, finding minor issues but nothing critical. The ice was building up, yes, but the system was designed to handle this kind of load. What they didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that the freezing rain wouldn't stop. It would continue for hours, then days, adding layer upon layer of ice with patient, relentless accumulation. By afternoon, the first line failures began. A tree branch came down on a residential street, taking the power line with it. Bob's team responded, but the conditions were deteriorating rapidly. The roads were becoming skating rinks, making every drive hazardous. When they reached the downed line, Bob saw immediately that this was different from normal winter damage. The ice coating everything was already an inch thick, and it was still raining. The repair took twice as long as usual because every surface was slippery. Tools kept sliding out of cold, numbed hands, and climbing the pole required extreme caution. They finished just as darkness fell, and dispatch immediately sent them to another call. Then another and another. The failures were accelerating, spreading across the region like a contagion. Bob called Marie around 8 that evening, using a payphone at a gas station. The connection was poor, filled with static. He told her not to wait up, that this was going to be a long night. She understood. She'd been a lineman's wife long enough to know that storms meant long hours. What neither of them understood yet was that long hours would stretch into days, then weeks. That this storm would become the defining event of Bob's career, and possibly his life. By midnight, Bob's team had responded to 7 emergencies, and the radio was crackling with dozens more. The ice was now 2 inches thick on some surfaces, and branches were coming down everywhere. At 2 a.m., they witnessed something Bob had never seen before. A primary line snapped under the weight of ice, not from a falling branch, but from pure, accumulated load. The cable dropped to the ground with a shower of sparks, and an entire neighborhood went dark. They worked until dawn, when the shift supervisor called them back to the depot. The scale of the disaster was becoming clear. Thousands of customers were without power across the region. Hundreds of lines were down, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. Bob managed 3 hours of sleep in the break room before being called out again. His body ached with exhaustion, but there was no choice. Every available worker was needed. The second day was worse than the first. Bob's team moved from crisis to crisis, but they were fighting a losing battle. For every line they restored, 5 more failed. The ice kept accumulating, and the infrastructure, designed for harsh winters, had never been intended to bear this kind of sustained weight. Bob climbed pole after pole, his hands raw and blistered inside his gloves. The ice made every surface treacherous, and several times he nearly slipped, catching himself at the last moment. The physical exhaustion was profound, but what wore on him more was the futility. They were working as hard as they could, but it wasn't enough. The storm was winning. On the third day, Bob witnessed the collapse of a substation. The ice had built up on the steel framework until the structure simply buckled, folding in on itself like cardboard. The sound was tremendous, screeching metal, explosive sparks, then the deep groan of total failure. When it was over, 20,000 customers had lost power in an instant. Bob stood watching the aftermath, too exhausted to feel shock. This was beyond anything the grid could handle. This required not repair, but complete rebuilding. The calls kept coming. Hospitals switching to backup generators, nursing homes where elderly residents were at risk from the cold, families trapped in rural areas without heat or food. Each call carried its own weight of urgency, its own human cost. Bob and his team did what they could, prioritizing the most critical situations, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. Food became whatever they could grab between calls, fast food, when restaurants still had power, vending machine snacks, eventually just energy bars and coffee. Bob lost track of what he'd eaten or when. Sleep was even scarcer. They worked 18-hour shifts, sometimes 20, catching sleep in the truck between calls or in brief intervals back at the depot. Bob's world narrowed to a simple cycle: drive, assess, climb, repair, repeat. Everything else, his family, his home, his normal life, became abstract, distant, unreal. Marie and the children had evacuated to her sister's place in Vermont on the 4th day. At least they were safe and warm, That knowledge kept Bob going when his body wanted to quit. He spoke to Marie once more, briefly on the 5th day. She was crying, worried about him, but he didn't have time to comfort her properly. He promised he was being careful, that he'd come home when this was over. He didn't tell her about the close calls, the near falls, the exhaustion so deep it made his vision blur. The damage kept spreading. Rural areas were being hit hardest, with some communities completely cut off. No power, no phones, roads impassable due to ice and fallen trees. The military was called in, setting up emergency shelters and distribution points. Helicopters flew low over the frozen landscape, dropping supplies to stranded families. But the real work of restoration, the unglamorous, dangerous work of climbing poles and splicing lines, fell to people like Bob. They were the only ones who could fix this, one connection at a time. On the 7th day, Bob's hands were so damaged from the cold and the work that they bled when he flexed his fingers. The skin was cracked, raw, covered in cuts and blisters that wouldn't heal. He wrapped them in gauze and kept working. What else could he do? His face was wind-burned, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and the constant glare of ice reflecting weak sunlight. He'd aged years in a week, and he could see the same transformation in his teammates. They didn't talk much anymore, except for the necessary technical communications. There wasn't energy for conversation, and words seemed inadequate anyway. What they were experiencing together, this grinding exhaustion, this fight against impossible conditions, created a bond that didn't need verbal expression. They understood each other through shared silence. On the 9th day, Bob worked on a line near a small town where the entire main street was dark. As he spliced the connection, he could see people watching from windows, faces pale and tired, eyes full of hope. When the repair was complete and power flowed back into the buildings, lights came on one by one. Bob, suspended in the bucket, watched those lights bloom in the darkness. He heard cheering, saw people emerge from their homes despite the cold, waving at him with genuine gratitude. For a moment, the exhaustion lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose so strong it brought tears to his eyes. This was why he did this work. Not for the paycheck or the routine, but for moments like this, when his labor directly changed people's lives, bringing warmth and light back to those who'd been sitting in cold darkness. But the moment passed, and there were more calls waiting. The truck moved on to the next emergency, and the next, in an endless chain of need. By the end of the 2nd week, Bob had worked nearly 200 hours with minimal sleep. His body operated on autopilot, muscle memory taking over when conscious thought became too difficult. Other workers were showing similar signs of extreme exhaustion. One lineman fell asleep in his truck and had to be woken by his supervisor. Another broke down crying at a job site, overwhelmed by the scale of destruction. These men were tough, experienced professionals, but everyone has limits, and they'd reached theirs. The utility companies brought in crews from other regions, workers from Ontario, from the United States, from anywhere they could find people with the necessary skills. The reinforcements helped, but the work remained overwhelming. Bob's team was assigned a liaison worker from Vermont, a young lineman named Josh, who'd volunteered to help. Josh was eager and skilled, but he was shocked by what he saw. "I've never seen anything like this," Josh said, surveying a neighborhood where every pole was either down or damaged. Bob just nodded. There were no words adequate to describe it. They worked together for 3 days, and Josh learned what the Quebec crews already knew. This wasn't a normal storm response. This was a war of attrition against physics and nature, and victory would come slowly, one pole at a time. On the 14th day, power was finally restored to St. Hyacinthe. Bob's supervisor called him on the radio to tell him, voice thick with emotion. Bob pulled the truck over to the side of an icy road and sat there, engine running, heat blowing from the vents. His hands were shaking, from exhaustion, from relief, from emotions he didn't have names for. He thought about his house with its blue shutters, about Marie and the children safe in Vermont. He thought about his neighbors, people he'd known for years, sitting in their homes with lights on and heat flowing. And then he cried. Not loud, dramatic sobs, but quiet tears that rolled down his wind-burned cheeks while he sat alone in the cab of his truck. It wasn't joy exactly, though joy was part of it. It was release, the release of 2 weeks of pressure, fear, responsibility, and exhaustion that he'd been carrying without pause. He allowed himself 5 minutes, then wiped his face, put the truck in gear, and drove to the next call. His region had power, but others didn't, and the work wasn't finished. It would be another week before Bob finally went home. By then, the worst of the crisis had passed, though restoration efforts would continue for weeks more in the hardest-hit areas. When he walked through his front door, Marie barely recognized him. He'd lost 15 pounds, his face was gaunt and weathered, and his hands were wrapped in bandages. She held him without speaking, and he leaned into her embrace, too tired even to articulate what he'd been through. The children hugged his legs, chattering about Vermont and school and friends, and he tried to focus on their voices. That night, he slept for 14 hours straight, his body finally given permission to rest. When he woke, it was to Marie sitting beside the bed, watching him with worried eyes. "You scared me," she said quietly. He took her hand, careful of his damaged fingers, and squeezed gently. "I know," he replied. "I scared myself." The utility gave him 2 weeks off, mandatory rest after what they were calling exceptional service during extraordinary circumstances, official language for something that defied normal description. Bob spent those weeks at home, slowly returning to himself. His hands healed, though they would always bear scars from that winter. His sleep remained disturbed, broken by dreams of ice and darkness and endless poles stretching into the distance. He'd wake in the night, disoriented, thinking he heard dispatch calling his name. Marie was patient, understanding in the way that comes from years of partnership. She didn't push him to talk, but when he did, in fragments, in late-night whispers, she listened. He told her about the substation collapse, about the faces in the windows when power returned, about the exhaustion so complete he'd sometimes forgotten where he was. He told her about Josh from Vermont and about his teammates who'd become brothers through shared ordeal. What he couldn't quite articulate was how the storm had changed his relationship with his work. Before, it had been a job, a good job, a necessary job, but still just employment. Now it felt different. He'd seen firsthand what happened when the grid failed, had witnessed the human cost of darkness and cold. He'd also experienced the profound satisfaction of restoration, of bringing light back to people who'd been sitting in the dark. That experience had transformed something in him. When Bob returned to work, he found that his teammates shared this transformation. They didn't talk about it directly, that wasn't their way, but it was there in how they approached their work, in the increased care and attention they brought to even routine tasks. They'd seen what failure looked like, and none of them wanted to see it again. Every connection they made, every line they inspected, carried the weight of that knowledge. The storm became a reference point, a dividing line in their professional lives. New workers who hadn't experienced it were quietly regarded as untested, while those who'd lived through it shared an unspoken bond. Years later, long after the broken poles had been replaced and the damaged substations rebuilt, Bob would still pause sometimes before flipping a light switch, just for a heartbeat, just for a moment of recognition. He never took electricity for granted again. He understood, in a way most people didn't, that every light that came on represented thousands of workers maintaining an invisible infrastructure, fighting weather and physics, and the constant entropy that tried to pull everything apart. The great ice storm had made heroes of ordinary workers, but it had also revealed something troubling: how fragile the whole system was. One storm, in the right conditions, could bring it all down. Bob carried that knowledge with him always, a quiet anxiety that lived beneath his professional competence. He knew what could happen, and he knew that someday, somewhere, it probably would happen again. But he also knew that when it did, there would be workers like him, tired, cold, determined, who would climb the poles and splice the lines and fight to restore the light. That knowledge gave him hope, even as the memory of those frozen weeks lingered like a scar that never quite faded. When the freezing rain finally stopped and the sky cleared, people emerged from their dark houses into a world transformed. What they found waiting outside defied easy description, something between catastrophe and miracle. The storm had lasted 5 days, though it felt longer to those who endured it. During that time, the rain had fallen continuously, each droplet freezing on contact with every surface it touched. The forests of the northeast had become forests of glass. Every tree, every branch, every twig was encased in ice so thick and clear it looked manufactured, deliberate, impossible. The coating wasn't uniform. It varied with elevation, exposure, and the mysterious microclimate variations that make each forest unique. In some places, the ice measured only an inch thick, while in others it exceeded 4 inches, transforming branches into massive crystalline structures. Photographers arrived within days, drawn by reports that were spreading through news channels and radio broadcasts. What they found exceeded even the most dramatic descriptions. In the Adirondacks, entire mountainsides glittered like crystal palaces. In Vermont's Green Mountains, forests that had stood for centuries now bowed under coatings of ice 3 inches thick. The weight on individual trees was staggering. Foresters would later calculate that a mature maple could be carrying several tons of ice, far beyond what its structure was designed to bear. Some trees had already snapped under the load, their broken trunks jutting up like shattered bones. Others had bent so far they formed arches, their crowns touching the ground, trapped in postures of impossible submission. But in those first days after the storm, before the full damage became apparent, what struck observers most was the beauty. It was a beauty that hurt to witness, too intense, too alien to be comfortable. The morning light made everything worse and better simultaneously. As the sun rose, it caught the ice at angles that turned entire hillsides into fields of diamond fire. A photographer named Sarah Chen arrived in upstate New York on January 12th, 3 days after the rain finally stopped. She'd driven from Boston, navigating roads still treacherous with ice, compelled by descriptions she'd heard on the radio. The drive had taken twice as long as normal. Power lines lay across roads, their ice-laden cables too heavy for the poles to support, and cleanup crews worked around the clock to clear essential routes. Nothing had prepared her for what she encountered. She parked her car near a trailhead in the Adirondacks and walked into the forest as afternoon light slanted through the trees. The entrance to the trail was marked by a warning sign, though it was barely visible beneath its coating of ice. Sarah ignored it, drawn forward by something she couldn't name, a compulsion that felt almost religious. The first sensation was sound, or rather the absence of it. The forest was completely silent, no birds, no animals, no wind rustling through leaves. Every surface was so heavily coated in ice that normal forest sounds couldn't happen. The silence was profound, almost spiritual, like entering a cathedral made of glass. She stopped walking and simply stood, letting the quiet wash over her. In the absence of sound, other senses heightened. She became aware of her own breathing, her heartbeat, the slight creak of her winter coat with each movement. Sarah raised her camera and began shooting, but even as she clicked the shutter, she knew the images would be inadequate. The camera couldn't capture the quality of light here, the way it refracted and multiplied through millions of ice-coated surfaces. Every branch was a prism, every tree trunk threw rainbows onto the snow below. The interplay of light created patterns that seemed to move as she shifted position. What appeared solid from one angle became translucent from another, and the forest revealed itself as a structure of infinite complexity. The forest had become a living kaleidoscope, and the effect was almost overwhelming. Beauty approaching the sublime, where pleasure and fear merge into something that makes the heart race. Sarah walked deeper into the woods, moving carefully across ice-crusted snow that crunched with each step. Each footfall sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. The snow beneath the ice crust was powdery and deep, and occasionally her foot would break through, plunging her knee-deep into cold whiteness. The trees around her groaned constantly, a low sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was the sound of wood, under impossible stress, of fibers compressing and straining against weight they were never meant to carry. The groaning was almost musical in its way, a chord of deep tones that rose and fell with subtle variations. Sarah found herself listening for patterns, trying to predict when the sounds would crescendo. As she walked, she heard a sharp crack somewhere to her left. Instinctively she froze, listening. The crack was followed by a sound like tearing fabric, then a tremendous crash as a massive branch gave way and fell. The impact sent ice cascading through the canopy above, creating a brief, musical rain of crystals. The falling ice caught the light as it descended, creating a momentary shower of prismatic color. Sarah stood perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to disturb whatever delicate equilibrium kept the other branches from falling. Sarah realized that the forest was still breaking, still surrendering to the weight it carried. This wasn't a static scene, but an ongoing collapse, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Every few minutes, another crack would sound, another branch would fall. The forest was slowly destroying itself, and she was witnessing the process in real time. She photographed a birch tree that had bent entirely over, its top touching the ground, forming a perfect arch of ice. The tree was still alive. She could see green beneath the bark. But it would never stand straight again. The birch's flexibility had saved it from breaking, but condemned it to a permanent deformity. In spring, if it survived, it would leaf out in this bent position, forever marked by what it had endured. Nearby, a sugar maple had split down its center, the two halves leaning away from each other like dancers, frozen mid-step. Ice sealed the wound, preserving the moment of destruction in crystalline clarity. Sarah could see deep into the split where the tree's rings were visible, counting out decades of slow growth. All those years of patient accumulation ended in a single, violent moment when the wood could bear no more. She photographed the split maple from multiple angles, trying to capture the strange grace of its destruction. The tree seemed to be reaching in two directions at once, pulled apart by forces it couldn't resist. Sarah spent 3 hours in that forest, and in that time, she didn't see or hear another person. The world had become a place of ice and silence and light, and she was alone in it, witnessing something that felt almost sacred. The isolation added to the strangeness of the experience. She began to feel as if she'd stepped outside normal time, into a pocket dimension where the usual rules didn't apply. When she finally emerged back at her car, her fingers were numb and her camera's battery was nearly dead. But she had hundreds of images, none of which would truly capture what she'd experienced. Her face was wind-burned, her clothes were soaked from brushing against ice-laden branches, and her legs ached from the difficult walking. But she felt exhilarated, as if she'd survived something significant. That night, in a motel room lit by candles, the power still out in this region, she scrolled through her photos on the camera's small screen. They were beautiful, technically excellent, but they missed something essential. The colors looked flat on the screen, the depth impossible to perceive in 2 dimensions. The photographs showed trees covered in ice, but they didn't show why that mattered, why it felt important. The forest had possessed a quality that photography couldn't record. Maybe it was the cold, the way it made the air taste metallic and sharp. Maybe it was the silence, so complete it felt like pressure on the eardrums. Maybe it was the knowledge that this was temporary, that spring would come and melt everything away, leaving only broken trees and memory. Sarah tried to write in her journal, attempting to put words to what she'd felt. But language failed her, reducing complex emotions to simple adjectives that felt inadequate and cheap. In the weeks that followed, other photographers made similar pilgrimages. Some were professionals, others were amateurs with basic cameras, all drawn by the same impulse to witness and record this unprecedented transformation. They came from across the country and beyond. A photographer from Japan arrived, having seen footage on international news, and spent a week documenting the phenomenon with quiet intensity. A photographer from National Geographic spent 2 weeks documenting the ice forests, producing a photo essay that would win awards. But even he admitted in interviews that the images were pale shadows of the actual experience. "You had to be there," he said repeatedly. "You had to feel the cold, hear the silence, stand beneath those trees and feel small and temporary." He spoke about the inadequacy of the medium with surprising candor. Photography, he explained, worked by capturing light, but what mattered here was everything light couldn't convey: temperature, sound, the passage of time, the awareness of imminent collapse. Scientists arrived too, approaching the phenomenon from different angles. Climatologists studied the weather conditions that had created the storm, trying to understand the precise combination of factors that had made it so devastating. They mapped pressure systems and temperature gradients, tracking the collision of Arctic air with moisture-laden southern winds. The storm had resulted from a rare alignment of conditions, they concluded, unlikely to repeat in exactly this way. Foresters assessed the damage, counting fallen trees and estimating recovery times. Some forests, they concluded, would take 50 years to recover their former density and structure. In particularly hard-hit areas, recovery might take a century or more. The old-growth forests that had been destroyed couldn't be replaced in any human time frame. Physicists measured ice thickness and calculated the loads borne by different tree species. Their data was precise and valuable, but like the photographs, it somehow missed the essential quality of the experience. Numbers could describe the weight, but they couldn't convey what it meant to see a tree struggling under that weight, bent almost to breaking, caught in a slow-motion catastrophe. What the scientists did document was remarkable in its own right. In some locations, ice had accumulated to depths of 4 inches, with densities approaching solid crystal. The ice wasn't uniform in structure. Core samples revealed complex layering that corresponded to different phases of the storm. Each layer told part of the story, preserved in frozen water. Trees that remained standing had adapted their structure, subtly shifting the distribution of weight to avoid catastrophic failure. It was a demonstration of organic engineering that amazed the researchers. Conifers had fared better than deciduous trees, their flexible branches allowing ice to slide off more easily. But even they showed signs of stress, with some branches permanently deformed by the weight they'd carried. But certain species couldn't adapt. Sugar maples, with their wide-spreading branches, were particularly vulnerable. Their branch architecture, which made them so beautiful in full leaf, became their downfall under ice. The horizontal branches collected and held ice in ways that vertical branches did not, creating impossible loads. Across the region, ancient maple groves, some with trees dating back 200 years, were decimated. Entire orchards used for maple syrup production were destroyed, representing not just ecological loss, but economic and cultural devastation. The destruction of maple groves hit hardest in communities where sugaring was both livelihood and tradition. Families who had tapped the same trees for generations faced the loss of income, identity, and continuity with the past. One Vermont farmer stood in his ruined sugar bush, surveying generations of work reduced to splintered wood and fallen trunks. He didn't cry, he was past tears, but his face held a grief that words couldn't touch. His name was Robert Duchamp, and his family had owned this land since 1847. The oldest trees in the grove had been planted by his great-great-grandfather, and he had expected to pass them on to his own grandchildren. These trees had been planted by his grandfather. He had tapped them every spring of his adult life, collecting sap that became syrup, maintaining a tradition that stretched back through his family's history. The rhythm of sugaring had structured his year, pruning in summer, preparing equipment in fall, tapping in late winter, boiling in early spring. Now that rhythm was broken, and he felt unmoored, as if the calendar itself had stopped making sense. Now they were gone, and with them went something more than wood and sap. A connection to the past, to the land, to a way of life, all broken by ice. Robert walked among the fallen trunks, running his hand along the familiar bark. Some trees he recognized individually, the one with the odd double tap holes from when he'd been learning, the giant near the stone wall that always produced the sweetest sap. He found his grandfather's old tap holes in one fallen trunk, the scars barely visible after decades of growth. The tree had outlived the man who first tapped it by 60 years, but it hadn't survived the storm. Yet even in the devastation, people reported experiencing something extraordinary. A hiker in New Hampshire described walking through an ice forest at dawn, watching the first light hit the trees. "It was like being inside a diamond," she said. Every tree was on fire with light, but cold fire, frozen fire. Her name was Lisa Wang, and she was a biology teacher from Manchester. She'd gone hiking despite warnings, feeling compelled to see the transformation before it ended. She stood there for an hour, she estimated, though time felt strange in that crystalline landscape. When she finally continued hiking, she felt changed somehow, marked by the experience. The quality of light had been beyond description. Each ice-coated surface became a source of illumination, catching and throwing light in unpredictable directions until the entire forest glowed. Others reported similar reactions. The ice forests created a liminal space, neither natural nor artificial, neither beautiful nor terrible, but somehow both at once. People spoke of feeling disoriented, uncertain of scale and distance. The ice's refractive properties made familiar landscapes unfamiliar, turning known trails into alien territory. Visitors spoke in hushed tones as if in the presence of something holy. Some brought their children, wanting them to witness this once-in-a-lifetime phenomenon. Parents struggled to explain what they were seeing, reaching for comparisons that always fell short. "It's like a fairy tale," some said, though the ice forests were more strange than any fairy tale, more real and more impossible simultaneously. The children were less impressed than the adults, seeing mainly trees covered in ice, remarkable but not mystical. Perhaps you had to understand what forests normally were to grasp how profoundly this transformation altered them. A child who had never experienced a forest in summer couldn't fully appreciate the wrongness of the ice forests. They saw beauty without understanding the violence that had created it. Elderly visitors, however, often reacted with intense emotion. Many had lived their entire lives in these regions, had walked these forests countless times, and seeing them transformed into glass felt like losing a friend and gaining a stranger simultaneously. They remembered these forests as they had been, dense with summer leaves, rustling with autumn wind, peaceful under winter snow. This transformation felt like a violation, even as it compelled admiration. One elderly man in Quebec walked into a forest he'd known since childhood and promptly sat down in the snow, overcome. He couldn't articulate what he felt, grief mixed with awe, loss mixed with wonder. His name was Jean-Pierre Gagnon, and he was 83 years old. He'd walked these trails with his father as a boy, courted his wife among these trees, brought his own children here to teach them the names of plants and birds. The forest had been a constant in his life, changing with seasons but fundamentally stable. Now it was something else entirely, and he felt the weight of that change as a physical pain in his chest. The ice forests became pilgrimage sites, destinations for people trying to process what the storm had done. Visiting them was a way of witnessing, of acknowledging, of attempting to understand the incomprehensible. Tour companies began organizing expeditions, advertising once-in-a-lifetime opportunities to see the transformed landscape. Some charged premium prices, positioning the tours as exclusive experiences. Local communities had mixed feelings about the influx of visitors. Some welcomed them, seeing an opportunity for tourism revenue in regions economically devastated by the storm. Hotels that had been empty in winter filled with photographers and tourists. Restaurants that might have closed opened early to serve breakfast to people heading out to the forests at dawn. Others resented the photographers and gawkers, seeing them as disaster tourists exploiting tragedy for aesthetic pleasure. There was truth in both perspectives, and the tension remained unresolved. Arguments broke out in town meetings about whether to encourage tourism or preserve the dignity of the damaged landscape. No consensus emerged. The wounds were too fresh, the losses too new. What everyone agreed on was that the forests had to be seen to be believed. Descriptions failed, photographs failed, even video footage failed to convey the full impact. Television crews arrived with professional cameras, filming segments for evening news broadcasts, but the footage, played back on screens thousands of miles away, looked strangely flat, the wonder somehow lost in transmission. You had to stand beneath those glass trees, hear the groaning of stressed wood, feel the cold air and the strange quality of light, experience the profound silence. Only then could you understand what the storm had created. The understanding was physical, visceral, impossible to translate into words or images. It existed in the moment of experiencing and nowhere else. As winter progressed, the ice began its slow transformation. On warmer days, sunlight would melt the surface layer slightly, creating even more complex refractions of light. The melting changed the ice's texture, turning its surface rough and crystalline. Water would run down the trunks in thin streams during the day, then refreeze at night into delicate ice formations. At night, when temperatures plunged, new layers would freeze on top of old ones, building up in geological strata of ice that told the storm's story in crystal. These layers were visible in cross-section where ice had broken away from branches. Each layer marked a warming and cooling cycle, a timeline written in frozen water. Scientists who studied these layers found they could date different moments of the storm, seeing where one system had passed and another had arrived. The ice was an archive, preserving temporal information in its frozen structure. Glaciologists accustomed to reading ice cores from polar regions applied their techniques to these forest ice samples. They found pollution markers, pollen grains, and ash particles trapped in the layers, each telling part of the storm's larger story. But the most remarkable phenomenon occurred on certain afternoons when conditions aligned perfectly. Sunlight hitting ice-laden forests at particular angles would create what locals called ice rainbows, complete circular rainbows that seemed to hang in the air around observers. These weren't the arcs of normal rainbows, but full circles visible in every direction. Standing in the center of an ice rainbow felt like existing at the heart of a sphere of light. These optical effects were caused by sunlight refracting through billions of ice crystals simultaneously, each one acting as a tiny prism. The result was ethereal, otherworldly, like standing inside a soap bubble made of light. The physics were well understood, light splitting into component wavelengths, each angle of refraction producing a different color. But understanding the mechanism didn't diminish the wonder of experiencing it. People who witnessed ice rainbows described them as peak experiences, moments of such intense beauty they became almost painful. Some laughed, others cried, all felt the inadequacy of normal emotional responses. A poet who saw an ice rainbow tried later to write about it and found herself unable to proceed. Every word she chose felt wrong, diminishing rather than capturing the experience. Social media filled with photographs of ice rainbows, but none quite captured their essence. The full-circle nature of the phenomenon didn't translate to flat images, and the emotional impact was lost in digital reproduction. By late February, the ice was beginning to melt in earnest. The forests slowly emerged from their glass coating, revealing the full extent of damage underneath. What had seemed beautiful at a distance became tragic up close. Trees that had appeared intact were actually shattered, held together only by ice that was now disappearing. The melting revealed splits and cracks that had been invisible under the ice coating. Trees that had looked healthy were mortally wounded, their vascular systems disrupted beyond recovery. As the melt progressed, entire trees would suddenly collapse, their structural integrity compromised beyond recovery. The sound of falling timber became constant background noise in affected regions. Walking in the forests during the melt was dangerous. Without warning, a tree that had stood for days might suddenly topple, its hidden damage finally overwhelming its remaining strength. Foresters marked trees for removal, a heartbreaking triage of deciding which could be saved and which were too damaged to survive. Chainsaws buzzed through the warming air, cutting down trees that had survived centuries, only to fall to human intervention after the storm. Each tree required evaluation by experienced foresters who could read the signs of internal damage. They looked for cracks in the bark, unnatural leans, split trunks, any indication that the tree was doomed. The lumber salvaged from these trees was sold as ice storm wood, marketed for its unique story. Furniture makers and artists bought it, seeing in the damaged grain patterns a record of trauma and survival. The wood showed stress patterns unlike anything in normal lumber. Dark lines marked where cells had been crushed by weight, creating designs that were both beautiful and unsettling. Some pieces commanded high prices, which struck many as grotesque, profiting from disaster, turning tragedy into commodity, but others argued that using the wood honored the trees, giving them purpose in death. Craftspeople who worked with ice storm wood spoke about feeling a responsibility to the material. They tried to design pieces that acknowledged the wood's history, that carried forward the story of survival and loss. A woodworker in Maine created a series of bowls from ice storm maple, leaving the stress patterns visible in the final pieces. He sold them at art fairs, sharing the story of each tree's final days with buyers. By April, the ice was completely gone, but the forests remained transformed. Canopies that had been dense were now open to the sky, allowing light to reach the forest floor in new patterns. Sunlight flooded into areas that had been shaded for decades. The forest floor, previously dim and carpeted with shade-loving plants, began to change as sun-loving species took advantage of the new conditions. This change in light distribution would affect everything: what plants grew, which animals thrived, how water moved through the ecosystem. The effects would cascade for decades, reshaping these forests at fundamental levels. Wildflowers that normally didn't grow in forest interiors began appearing in the gaps. Brambles and shrubs that required full sun colonized the spaces where old trees had stood. Ecologists began long-term studies, marking plots and tracking changes. These forests would become outdoor laboratories, offering insights into ecosystem response to catastrophic disturbance. They established permanent monitoring stations, returning each season to count species, measure growth, and document the slow process of recovery. The data would inform forest management practices for generations. But for the people who lived in these regions, the forests were more than research sites. They were places of memory, landscapes that now carried the weight of shared trauma and shared wonder. Every gap in the canopy was a reminder. Every young tree growing where an old one had stood marked a before and after, a world divided by the storm. Years later, people would still talk about the ice forests, using that phrase to denote a specific time and place. Children who'd been too young to remember would hear the stories and feel they'd missed something important. The stories took on mythic qualities in the retelling. Details were amplified, emotions heightened, until it became difficult to separate memory from legend. The photographs survived, hanging in galleries and appearing in books, beautiful but inadequate. They captured light and form but missed the essence, the cold, the silence, the way the forest felt, both dead and impossibly alive. Museum exhibitions featured large-format prints of the ice forests, displayed in darkened galleries with contemplative lighting. Visitors would stand before them for long minutes, trying to imagine what it had been like. Some photographers who documented the phenomenon returned annually, shooting the same locations at the same time of year. They created time-lapse sequences showing how the forests recovered, how gradually the scars healed. These return visits became personal rituals, ways of processing the original experience by witnessing its aftermath. Some photographers continued for decades, building archives that documented slow ecological change. But the forests never returned to their original state. The broken canopy allowed different species to take root, changing the composition gradually. Ecological succession, normally a process spanning centuries, was compressed and accelerated. The forests were healing on fast forward, racing through stages of recovery that would usually take generations. Where maples had fallen, birches and pines grew up in their place. The forests were healing, but into something new, something shaped by the storm's legacy. The new growth was vigorous but young, lacking the gravitas of old-growth forest. Where trees had once been measured in centuries, they were now measured in years. Hikers who visited these forests a decade later would sometimes stop, noticing something off about the canopy, a lack of old growth, an evenness in tree height that felt unnatural. These were the markers of the storm, still visible to observant eyes. The uniformity was eerie to those who knew what to look for. In undisturbed forest, trees vary widely in age and size, creating a complex vertical structure. Ice storm forests all grew back at once, creating an artificial evenness. And on certain January days, when ice formed on the trees, normal winter ice, nothing like the storm, long-time residents would pause and remember. They'd look at the thin coating of frost and feel a ghost of that old fear, that old wonder. The memories were triggered by specific things: the angle of winter light through bare branches, the sound of ice cracking on a pond, the metallic smell of very cold air. Each would transport them back momentarily to those weeks after the storm. The crystal forest had existed for only a brief time, but its memory persisted. It had revealed something about the world that couldn't be unseen, that beauty and destruction weren't opposites, but partners, that nature could transform the familiar into the alien, that the world contained possibilities for wonder that most people never imagined. The experience had changed how people saw ordinary things, Normal ice storms, once merely inconvenient, now carried echoes of that greater transformation, making people more aware of nature's capacity for the extraordinary. And perhaps most importantly, it had demonstrated that there were experiences which couldn't be fully captured or communicated. Some things had to be witnessed firsthand, felt in the body, processed in the moment. This knowledge was both frustrating and liberating. It meant that something essential about the experience remained private, beyond the reach of media and commerce, preserved only in individual memory. The ice forests were one of those things, a phenomenon that existed not just in physical space but in the intersection of landscape, light, cold, and human consciousness. They were there, undeniably real, and then they were gone, leaving only stories and inadequate photographs and memories that faded like ice in spring. But the forgetting was slow, much slower than the melting. The ice forests lingered in collective memory, becoming part of regional identity, a reference point for understanding transformation and loss. Parents told their children about them. Teachers used them as examples in science classes, explaining freezing rain and ice accumulation, though the lessons never quite captured the wonder. The ice forests became a reminder that the world could still surprise, could still produce phenomena that exceeded human expectation and understanding. In an age of information saturation, when everything seemed documented and explained, they represented the possibility of genuine awe. And for those who had stood beneath those glass trees, who had heard the silence and seen the light and felt the cold, the memory remained vivid for years. Time might dull the details, but the core experience persisted. The sense of having witnessed something rare and precious, something that existed at the boundary between the beautiful and the terrible, the natural and the impossible. They carried that memory forward like a gift, sharing it when they could, keeping it close when words failed. It became part of who they were, a marker of having been present for something extraordinary, something that would never come again in quite the same way. In the wealthy suburbs of Montreal, in the elegant neighborhoods of Burlington, in the exclusive lakeside communities of the Adirondacks, the ice storm arrived without discrimination. Nature, it turned out, had no interest in property values or social standing. The blackout that devastated rural farmhouses also struck penthouse apartments in downtown Montreal's most prestigious towers. The same darkness that swallowed modest homes also consumed mansions with price tags in the millions. For the first time in their lives, many affluent residents discovered what it meant to be truly cold. Not the mild discomfort of waiting for an Uber in winter, but the deep, penetrating cold that makes sleep impossible and thought difficult. Not the fashionable cold of skiing weekends where retreat to a lodge fireplace was always minutes away. This was the kind of cold that settled into bones, that made fingers clumsy and thoughts slow, that transformed the simple act of existing into exhausting work. Margaret Ashford lived on the 28th floor of a luxury building in Montreal's Golden Square Mile. She was 63, a retired executive, accustomed to comfort as a baseline condition of existence. Her apartment had floor-to-ceiling windows that normally offered stunning views of the city skyline. Those same windows now made her home uninhabitable, glass conducts cold efficiently, and modern high-rises are designed to be hermetically sealed, which meant no way to ventilate or adjust for changing conditions. The building had been engineered for perfection, for controlled environments that never varied more than a few degrees. That engineering assumed an uninterrupted supply of electricity, a constant flow of power to climate control systems that made the sealed environment livable. Without power, the apartment became a glass box suspended in freezing air. The spectacular views that had justified the premium price now felt like a cruel joke, offering Margaret a panorama of a darkened city while trapping her in steadily dropping temperatures. When the power failed on the second night, Margaret assumed it would return within hours. She lit candles, found extra blankets, and settled in with a book to wait. She'd experienced brief outages before, summer storms that knocked out power for an hour or two, maintenance work that required temporary shutdowns. Those had been minor inconveniences, almost adventures, opportunities to use the emergency candles she'd bought years ago and never needed. By morning, the temperature in her apartment had dropped to 40 degrees. By the afternoon of the third day, she could see her breath indoors. The cold crept in gradually but relentlessly, like water seeping through a crack. First, it was merely uncomfortable, requiring an extra sweater. Then it became impossible to ignore, demanding constant movement to maintain warmth. Finally, it became dangerous, a physical presence that made her extremities ache and her thoughts feel sluggish. Margaret had never before understood cold as something that could threaten her life, and the realization arrived slowly, almost politely. Like an unwelcome guest, she was too well-mannered to refuse. The building's elevators were dead, which meant the only way out was 28 flights of stairs. Margaret considered herself fit for her age, but the prospect of descending and potentially having to climb back up was daunting. She stood at her apartment door for a long time, weighing her options. Stay and hope power returned soon, or attempt an escape that might leave her stranded at ground level, unable to return if she needed something she'd left behind. The decision felt impossibly weighty. Every choice carried risks that her comfortable life had never prepared her for, questions about physical capability and endurance that she'd never had to seriously consider. She tried to call for help, but cell towers were overwhelmed. Her landline was dead with the power. The silence from her phone was particularly unnerving. For decades, connection had been instantaneous, help always just a phone call away. Now the sleek device in her hand was an expensive paperweight, its sophisticated technology rendered useless by the absence of the infrastructure that gave it meaning. For the first time in decades, Margaret felt truly isolated, cut off not just from comfort, but from the infrastructure that usually made problems solvable. Money couldn't fix this, connections couldn't expedite restoration, and credit cards were useless in a city running on generators and cash. She thought about her network of contacts, lawyers, doctors, former colleagues in positions of influence. None of them could help her now. They were likely trapped in their own homes, facing their own versions of this crisis. The realization was profound and disorienting. Her entire adult life had been built on the assumption that resources and connections could solve any problem, that money was a universal solvent for difficulty. On the fourth day, a neighbor knocked on her door. He was younger, maybe 40, someone she'd passed in the hallway, but never spoken to beyond polite nods. His name was David, and he worked in something technical. She'd never bothered to learn exactly what. In the building's elevator, she'd occasionally noticed him carrying equipment, always polite but distant, maintaining the urban courtesy of mutual invisibility. He asked if she was okay, if she needed anything. His own apartment was just as cold, but he'd heard that some residents were attempting to leave, and he wanted to check on elderly neighbors before he went. Margaret felt a flush of emotion she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, certainly, but also something like shame that this stranger showed more concern for her welfare than she'd ever shown for his. She realized she'd lived in this building for 12 years without learning the names of most people on her floor. Margaret made a decision. She packed a small bag with essentials, medications, a change of clothes, important documents, and together they descended 28 flights in near-total darkness, using flashlights to navigate. The stairwell was frigid and echoed with their footsteps. Other residents passed them going up, having gone down for supplies, and now facing the long climb back. Some carried water in heavy jugs, breathing hard between floors. Others had backpacks full of groceries, moving slowly, stopping frequently to rest. The stairs had become the building's main artery, its single functioning pathway in a structure designed around mechanical vertical transportation. Everyone moved slowly, breathing hard, helping each other navigate patches of darkness where flashlight batteries had died. Class distinctions that normally defined this building, penthouses versus regular floors, old money versus new, dissolved in the shared ordeal of descent. A woman in an expensive coat held the flashlight while a man in maintenance uniform helped an elderly gentleman navigate a landing. A teenager carried bags for a middle-aged woman neither of them knew. In the darkness, stripped of the visual markers that usually signaled status and hierarchy, people became simply bodies helping other bodies survive. The descent took nearly an hour. Margaret's legs trembled by the time they reached the bottom, her knees protesting the endless downward steps. She'd thought herself in good shape, but this physical demand was unlike anything her gym workouts had prepared her for. At ground level, they emerged into a lobby full of displaced residents. Some had been camping there for days, trying to stay near the building's generator-powered emergency lights. The lobby had been transformed into an improvised encampment. Sleeping bags and blankets covered the marble floors where usually only polished shoes walked. People had created small territories marked by luggage and supplies, temporary homes in a space designed for brief transition. Others were preparing to leave, heading for hotels or friends' homes or emergency shelters. The conversations were subdued, tinged with disbelief that this was happening in one of Canada's wealthiest neighborhoods. People spoke in low voices, sharing information about which roads were passable, which shelters still had space, which areas had power restored. The lobby had become an information exchange, knowledge flowing between strangers who would never have spoken in ordinary circumstances. Margaret ended up at a shelter in a community center 3 blocks away. The walk was treacherous. Ice made every step an exercise in balance, and by the time she arrived, she was exhausted and shaking with cold. David walked beside her the entire way, offering his arm on particularly icy patches. They moved in a group with several other residents, a small procession of the displaced, helping each other stay upright on the treacherous surface. The city looked alien under its coating of ice. Trees bowed under the weight, power lines sagged, and everything gleamed with a dangerous beauty. Margaret found herself noticing details she'd normally miss, the way ice transformed stop signs into sculptures, how the world looked both crystalline and broken. Inside, the shelter was crowded and warm, heated by industrial generators that rumbled constantly. Cots were arranged in rows, and people from all walks of life sat or lay, wrapped in emergency blankets. The noise was overwhelming at first. Generators, conversations, children crying, someone's persistent cough. After days of silence in her apartment, the density of human presence felt almost aggressive. But the warmth was intoxicating. Margaret stood near the door for several minutes, just absorbing heat, feeling sensation return painfully to her fingers and toes. Margaret found herself next to a young mother with 2 children. The woman worked as a housekeeper in the very building Margaret lived in, though they'd never met. Her name was Sophia, and her children were 6 and 8, wide-eyed and unusually quiet in the strange environment. She'd been at work when the power failed and had rushed home to find her apartment building already dark and freezing. They talked quietly, sharing what food they had. The woman offered Margaret half a sandwich, and Margaret accepted, realizing she hadn't eaten since breakfast. The sandwich was peanut butter and jelly, simple and slightly crushed from being in Sophia's bag. Margaret couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten peanut butter, and the taste carried unexpected comfort, a reminder of childhood lunches long forgotten. Sophia had brought crackers and juice boxes for her children. Margaret had protein bars from her emergency kit that she'd packed years ago and forgotten about. They created a small shared meal, pooling their meager supplies with the pragmatism of necessity. The social leveling was profound and disorienting. In this space, Margaret's wealth meant nothing. She had no more access to comfort than anyone else, no ability to pay for better conditions. They were all just people trying to stay warm, and that shared need erased everything else. Margaret thought about her apartment, the designer furniture, the artwork on the walls, the kitchen that had cost more than many people earned in a year. All of it was worthless now, unable to provide the most basic human need. Here, in this crowded community centre, with its industrial heating and rows of cots, she had more than she'd had in her luxury apartment: warmth and safety. Across the region, similar scenes played out in countless variations. In Burlington, Vermont, a family that owned 3 cars found all of them useless. The ice-covered roads were impassable, and no amount of money could change that. The cars sat in the driveway, expensive metal boxes rendered as immobile as sculptures. The Mercedes, the Range Rover, the Tesla, each represented different aspirations and achievements, each now equally incapable of movement. They walked to an emergency shelter carrying their young children, passing abandoned vehicles that represented thousands of dollars of depreciating value. The cars meant nothing now. What mattered was the ability to walk safely on ice. The father carried their 4-year-old son on his back, the weight making each step more precarious. The mother held their 7-year-old daughter's hand, moving slowly, testing each footfall. They passed a Porsche at the end of their street, its sleek lines absurd under a coating of ice. Someone had tried to drive it. There were scrape marks where it had slid sideways into a mailbox. Now it sat abandoned, blocking half the street, a monument to the limits of engineering. In Ottawa, a prominent lawyer found himself standing in line for free meals at a church basement kitchen. He'd never been inside this church before, despite living 2 blocks away for 15 years. The building was old stone, the kind of structure he'd walked past hundreds of times without really seeing it. Inside, it smelled of soup and candle wax, and the basement had low ceilings that trapped heat and conversation. The volunteers serving food didn't know or care about his profession. They ladled soup into his bowl with the same efficiency they used for everyone else: the homeless man ahead of him, the immigrant family behind him. One volunteer, an elderly woman with flour on her apron, asked if he wanted bread with his soup. Her tone was kind but matter-of-fact, the same tone she'd used for every person in line. There was something equalizing about that consistency, something that made him feel both diminished and oddly relieved. He sat at a long table next to strangers, eating soup that was too salty but wonderfully hot. Around him, conversations flowed in multiple languages: French, English, Arabic, Vietnamese. The man beside him spoke French with an accent the lawyer couldn't place. They exchanged basic information: where they lived, how long they'd been without power, in the tentative way of strangers sharing forced proximity. The storm had created an unexpected community, drawing together people who normally never shared space. In the candlelight, with frost forming on the church windows, everyone looked the same: cold, tired, grateful for warmth. The lawyer noticed things he'd never paid attention to before. The way people automatically made space for others at the crowded tables. How parents broke bread into small pieces for children without asking if anyone minded. The quiet dignity of the elderly man across from him, eating slowly, carefully, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted his spoon. Yet even in crisis, subtle hierarchies persisted. Some families had backup generators purchased after previous storms as insurance against exactly this scenario. These generators became neighborhood centers of power, literally. Extension cords snaked from houses with generators to neighbors' homes, creating temporary power-sharing networks. The cords created new maps of neighborhood relationships, visible lines of connection and dependency. Some stretched across yards, others ran along fences, bright orange against white snow and ice. They revealed who knew whom, who trusted whom, who was willing to share the precious resource of electricity. But generators required fuel, and fuel became a precious commodity. Gas stations either had no power to pump or had sold out completely. Those with connections, friends in the utility industry, relatives who owned gas stations, could sometimes acquire fuel when others couldn't. Money helped, but relationships helped more. Lines formed at the few stations that could pump gas, cars idling for hours, people sleeping in their vehicles to hold their place. Arguments broke out over cutting in line, over who had been there first, over whether emergency vehicles should get priority. In one wealthy Montreal neighborhood, a doctor who'd installed a large backup generator after a minor outage years earlier found his house becoming an impromptu community center. Neighbors came to charge phones, store insulin in his refrigerator, warm up for a few hours. Dr. Richard Chen had bought the generator almost on impulse, influenced by a colleague's story about losing vaccine supplies during a power outage. It had seemed like an extravagance at the time, sitting in his garage unused for 3 years. Now it was the most valuable thing he owned. He opened his home willingly, but the experience was exhausting. People arrived at all hours, and managing the generator required constant attention to fuel levels and load balance. He learned to calculate electrical loads in his head, mentally tallying what could run simultaneously without overloading the system. Refrigerator plus phone chargers plus a space heater, that worked. Add a laptop and the lights dimmed. It became a constant calculus of capacity and need. Some visitors were grateful and considerate, others acted entitled, as if his generosity were owed rather than given. One neighbor asked why he couldn't run his television so people could watch news. Another complained that the house wasn't warm enough, suggesting he turn up the heat. A third wanted to know if she could use his washing machine, as if laundry were an urgent necessity in a crisis. The doctor found himself doing triage, deciding who needed help most urgently, rationing generator time, negotiating between competing needs. It was emotionally draining in ways he hadn't anticipated. A diabetic neighbor needed refrigeration for insulin. That was non-negotiable, a medical necessity. An elderly couple needed a few hours of warmth each day. That seemed reasonable. But what about the teenager who wanted to charge his gaming system, or the man who wanted to run power tools to cut fallen branches? In contrast, in neighborhoods without generators, people had to rely entirely on each other and on public resources. In these areas, community bonds often grew stronger because no one had an advantage. Everyone was equally powerless. A retired teacher in a modest home near Plattsburgh organized her block. She went door to door checking on elderly and disabled neighbors, creating a list of who had what supplies and who needed what. Her name was Dorothy Martinez, and she'd taught 5th grade for 37 years before retiring. She brought to the crisis the same organizational skills she'd used managing classrooms full of children, systematic, calm, focused on practical solutions. They pooled resources. Someone had a camping stove, someone else had canned goods, a third person had medical training. Together they created a support network that kept everyone safe through the worst days. The camping stove became communal property, moving from house to house, allowing people to have at least one hot meal per day. The neighbor with medical training, a former EMT, checked on anyone with chronic conditions, monitoring blood pressure, ensuring medications were being taken. The teacher had very little money compared to the wealthy evacuees in hotels, but she had something more valuable in that moment, the skills and relationships to organize collective survival. Her modest home became a coordination center, more important than any penthouse. People reported to her house twice daily, sharing updates on their status and needs. She kept a notebook with careful records, who needed what, who had extra of something, which houses had been checked that day. Her kitchen table became a command center, maps and lists spreading across its surface. The storm revealed a truth that prosperity usually obscures, that resilience isn't primarily about individual resources but about community and adaptability. The people who weathered the storm best weren't always the wealthiest. They were those with strong social networks and practical skills. A farmer in rural Quebec, living below the poverty line, was uncomfortable but never in danger. He heated with wood, cooked on a wood stove, had a hand pump for water, and knew how to manage livestock without power. Jacques Moreau's farmhouse was over 100 years old, built in an era when electricity was unknown. The stone walls were thick, the wood stove massive and efficient. His life had never fully modernized, not from choice but from economics, and now that lack became an advantage. When his wealthier neighbors, weekenders with luxury cabins, found themselves stranded and freezing, he took them in without hesitation. They slept on his floor, ate his simple food, and learned that their expensive properties were built on assumptions that didn't hold in crisis. The cabins nearby were architectural showpieces featured in magazines with glass walls and modern heating systems that consumed enormous amounts of electricity. Without power, they were beautiful shells, colder inside than outside because they lacked any traditional heating source. One executive, sleeping on the farmer's floor after abandoning his powerless vacation home, remarked that he'd spent more on his luxury grill than the farmer probably made in a month, yet the grill was useless while the farmer's ancient wood stove kept everyone alive. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The grill, a top-of-the-line model with multiple burners and a temperature control system, sat on the executive's deck under inches of ice. It represented a certain vision of leisure and sophistication, summer evenings and carefully prepared meals. Now it was just metal and ceramic, as functionless as a sculpture. In cities, hotels filled immediately with those who could afford them. But hotels lost power too, and when they did, they became expensive shelters offering little more than homes did. A 4-star hotel in Montreal lost power on day 3. Guests who'd been paying $300 a night found themselves in dark rooms with no heat, no hot water, no room service. The hotel had backup generators, but they could only power emergency lighting and essential systems. The elevators stopped, leaving guests on high floors isolated. The heating system went silent. The spa, the restaurant, the business center, all the amenities that justified the premium price became unusable spaces. The hotel offered what it could: candles, extra blankets, cold meals assembled from whatever the kitchen could prepare without power. But the premium experience people had paid for was impossible to deliver. The staff worked tirelessly, climbing stairs to deliver blankets, organizing cold buffets in the lobby, trying to maintain some semblance of service. But they were limited by the same constraints affecting everyone else, unable to conjure electricity through effort alone. Some guests demanded refunds as if the hotel could control the storm. Others adapted, recognizing that everyone, staff and guests alike, were doing their best in impossible circumstances. One businessman berated a front desk clerk about the lack of hot water, his voice rising as he explained how important his morning shower was for his day. The clerk, who'd worked a 16-hour shift and walked 3 miles to get there because transit was down, listened with practiced patience. The hotel's restaurant became a gathering place, lit by candles, where guests and staff shared food and stories. In that space, the usual service dynamic shifted. Everyone was just people trying to stay warm and fed. A CEO sat next to a housekeeper, both wrapped in hotel blankets, both eating the same cold sandwiches. They talked about their families, their fears, their plans for when power returned. The housekeeper spoke about her daughter's asthma, her worry about whether the medication would stay effective in the cold. The CEO talked about his aging mother in a nursing home, his inability to reach her by phone, his fear that the facility's backup systems might fail. For a brief time, their professional identities became irrelevant. They were just 2 humans in the dark, finding comfort in conversation. Wealthy families who evacuated to second homes in warmer regions faced different challenges. They had resources to escape, which was an enormous privilege, but they also carried guilt about those left behind. One family drove from Montreal to their winter home in Florida, a trip that took 3 days instead of the usual 2 because of road conditions. When they arrived in sunshine and warmth, the contrast was jarring. The drive itself was surreal, moving from the ice-locked north through gradually warming temperatures, watching winter loosen its grip with each mile south. They'd left Montreal in extreme cold, roads treacherous, and arrived in Florida in 70-degree weather, palm trees swaying in a gentle breeze. They turned on lights with a mixture of relief and discomfort. Everything worked: heat, hot water, television, showing news from the storm zone. The house responded instantly to every switch and thermostat adjustment. Water poured hot from taps. The refrigerator hummed reliably. These ordinary miracles, barely noticed in normal times, now felt almost obscene in their abundance. They watched footage of people in shelters, of linemen working in brutal conditions, of families huddled in dark homes, and they felt strange, safe and warm, but oddly disconnected from something important. Their teenage daughter asked why they'd left when others couldn't. The father tried to explain about resources and prudence, but the answer felt hollow even as he spoke it. He talked about responsibility to keep the family safe, about the wisdom of using available options, about how they couldn't help anyone by suffering unnecessarily. But each explanation sounded like rationalization, like justification for an act that needed no justification legally, but felt ethically ambiguous. They'd saved themselves, which was rational, but they'd also abandoned their community in crisis. That tension was uncomfortable, unresolvable. The family made donations to relief funds which helped their conscience somewhat. But money felt like an inadequate response, a way of participating without actually being present, of helping without sharing the experience. The father transferred several $1,000s to organizations providing emergency services. It was a substantial sum, more than many people could give, yet it felt transactional, clean, a way of addressing guilt without actually addressing the underlying discomfort of having fled while others endured. Back in the storm zone, radio broadcasts became the great equalizer. Anyone with batteries could listen, and the callers represented every social class: doctors and janitors, executives and students, wealthy retirees and young families struggling to make rent. The radio stations ran on backup generators and became the region's nervous system, connecting isolated people, sharing information, creating community through airwaves. People listened obsessively, hungry for news, for connection, for proof that they weren't alone. They all shared the same problem: no power, too much cold, uncertainty about when things would improve. On the radio, stripped of visual cues about wealth or status, everyone's voice carried equal weight. A billionaire called in to ask about shelter locations, his voice holding the same strain as a minimum wage worker who called 5 minutes later. The storm had exposed their common humanity, their shared vulnerability to cold and darkness. The billionaire's name was recognized by the host, who knew him from news coverage of his business ventures. But that recognition didn't change the basic facts of his situation. He was cold, his home was uninhabitable, he needed help. Money couldn't change the weather or restore the power grid. One radio host remarked on air that the storm was a great leveler, and the phrase stuck. People repeated it in shelters, in dark homes, in emergency centers. It captured something true, that the storm had temporarily suspended normal social hierarchies, revealing that beneath all the structures of class and wealth, everyone needed the same basic things: warmth, food, safety, community. But even as people acknowledged this leveling, they also knew it was temporary. When power returned, normal hierarchies would reassert themselves. Those with resources would go back to their comfortable homes, while those without would return to struggle. The storm would become a story, an interesting experience to share at dinner parties for some, while for others it would be a financial catastrophe that took years to recover from. The shared experience of cold and darkness didn't erase structural inequality, it only made it visible for a brief time. Margaret Ashford spent 8 days in the emergency shelter before power was restored to her building. When she finally climbed back up those 28 flights, the elevators still not working, she was exhausted but changed. The climb took hours, with frequent stops to rest. Her legs burned, her lungs ached, and she questioned whether she could make it several times. Other residents climbed with her, a small group helping each other through the ordeal, sharing water, taking breaks together. Her apartment felt different when she entered it. All her possessions were there, untouched, but they seemed less important somehow. Dust had settled on everything. The plants she'd carefully tended had died from cold. The refrigerator, now running again, contained food that had spoiled days ago. The apartment needed cleaning, airing out, restoration, but those were minor problems, easily solved with time and effort. The art on the walls, the expensive furniture, the designer kitchen, none of it had helped her during the storm. What had helped was a neighbor's kindness, a stranger's offered sandwich, the community center's generator. She stayed in touch with the young mother from the shelter, meeting for coffee occasionally. They didn't become close friends, their lives were too different, but there was a connection forged in shared hardship that didn't quite disappear when normal life resumed. Sophia texted her occasionally with photos of her children, and Margaret found herself looking forward to these glimpses into a life completely unlike her own. They met once a month at a cafe midway between their neighborhoods and talked about ordinary things: weather, local news, the children's school progress. Margaret also changed her relationship with her building staff, the doorman, the cleaning crew, the maintenance workers. She'd always been polite, but now she saw them differently. During the storm, these workers had been essential, checking on residents, helping with evacuations, keeping emergency systems running. Their labor had mattered more than all the executives and professionals who lived in the building. She learned their names, asked about their families, noticed when someone was working a double shift. It was a small change, perhaps insufficient, but it represented a shift in awareness, an acknowledgement of dependency that prosperity had previously obscured. Across the region, others experienced similar shifts. The storm had revealed dependencies that prosperity usually made invisible, on workers who maintained infrastructure, on neighbors who checked in, on community resources like shelters and emergency services. For some, this awareness faded quickly once comfort returned. But for others, it lingered. They prepared differently for the next storm, yes, but they also thought differently about their place in the community, their relationship to those who had less, their own vulnerability despite their resources. The storm had taught that wealth was not armor against nature, that comfort was conditional and fragile. It had shown that in crisis, what mattered most wasn't money or status, but relationships, skills, and community. These lessons were uncomfortable for those accustomed to solving problems with resources alone. Yet the storm also demonstrated something about privilege that couldn't be ignored, that having resources created options. Those who could evacuate did, avoiding the worst hardships. Those with backup generators maintained some comfort and became neighborhood resources. Those with savings didn't have to choose between food and fuel. The wealthier residents could afford to replace spoiled food immediately, to hire help with cleanup, to book hotel rooms when power was slow to return. They could pay for medical care if the cold had aggravated health conditions. They could afford to take time off work to recover. The storm didn't eliminate inequality. In some ways, it highlighted it. But it also revealed that privilege had limits, that there were situations where money and status couldn't insulate people from shared human vulnerability. When spring came and the ice finally melted, life returned to its normal patterns. The wealthy went back to their penthouses, the poor to their modest homes. The social structures that the storm had briefly scrambled reasserted themselves. But something residual remained, a memory of cold and darkness shared across class lines, a brief glimpse of common humanity beneath social stratification. People who'd never spoken before maintained tentative connections. Neighborhoods that had seemed like collections of isolated individuals had discovered they were communities, and that discovery didn't completely disappear. Block associations formed in areas that had never had them. Neighbors exchanged phone numbers, created email lists for emergency communication. Some streets organized annual gatherings, marking the anniversary of the storm, keeping alive the sense of connection that crisis had created. The storm became part of the region's collective memory, a reference point people used to mark time, before the storm and after the storm. And in that collective memory was an implicit acknowledgement that the storm had revealed something true about the fragility of comfort and the persistence of inequality, about resilience and vulnerability, about what actually mattered when everything else fell away. The wealthy learned that they too could be cold, hungry, and helpless. The poor demonstrated that they possessed resilience and community that wealth couldn't buy. And everyone learned that the infrastructure supporting modern life, the grid, the supply chains, the communication networks, was far more fragile than anyone wanted to believe. One storm in the right conditions could strip it all away, leaving only humans and their capacity to endure, to help, to survive together in the darkness. Years later, people would still talk about the ice storm, the conversations carrying different meanings depending on who was speaking. For some, it was an adventure, a story of inconvenience overcome. For others, it was a trauma, a reminder of vulnerability and fear. But for many, it remained a moment of uncomfortable truth, when the comfortable discovered the limits of comfort, when the powerful experienced powerlessness, when everyone briefly stood on common ground and saw each other as they actually were. Human, vulnerable, dependent on forces and systems far beyond individual control. And so we return from that frozen world, from the great ice storm of 1998, when nature paused modern life and reminded millions what it means to be vulnerable. We've walked with those who endured it, the ordinary people shivering in dark houses, the exhausted linemen fighting ice and physics, the photographers capturing impossible beauty, the wealthy learning that comfort has limits. The storm lasted only days in its active phase, but its effects rippled outward for years, changing landscapes and lives in ways both visible and invisible. Forests transformed and struggled to recover. Communities discovered strength in shared hardship. Individuals carried new knowledge about fragility and resilience. Tonight, as you rest wherever you are, in warmth and light, or perhaps in the gentle darkness you've chosen for sleep, consider how different your world is from that frozen January. The distance between now and then is measured not just in years, but in the accumulated miracles of ordinary life. You can reach for a switch and summon light instantly, pushing back darkness with a simple gesture. You can adjust a thermostat and command warmth to fill your space, never thinking about the furnace that obeys, the gas that flows, the electricity that makes it all possible. You can connect across vast distances with a touch, speaking to loved ones on the other side of the world as if they were in the next room. These are miracles so ordinary that we forget they're miracles at all, so constant that we notice them only when they disappear. The ice storm reminded an entire region what life becomes when these everyday wonders vanish. It revealed the invisible infrastructure supporting modern existence, the power lines and transformers, the workers who maintain them, the complex systems that must function perfectly for life to feel normal. When that infrastructure failed, when the systems broke down under the weight of ice, people discovered how thin the barrier was between comfort and cold, between connection and isolation, between the modern world and something much older and harder. But the storm also revealed something beautiful about human nature, something that prosperity and comfort sometimes obscure. It showed that people are capable of remarkable resilience, that communities can form in crisis, that strangers will help strangers without expectation of reward. In the darkness and cold, when everything familiar had been stripped away, what remained was the essential human capacity for endurance, cooperation, and kindness. Neighbors who had never spoken learned each other's names. Workers pushed themselves beyond exhaustion to help people they would never meet. Strangers shared food, warmth, and shelter, creating temporary families bound by shared need. The storm had taken away comfort, but it had revealed something perhaps more valuable, the fundamental human ability to care for one another in the face of hardship. As sleep finds you now, let your mind drift through that crystalline landscape one last time. Picture the forests transformed into cathedrals of ice and light, where every branch glittered and every surface threw rainbows into the cold air. Imagine those dark houses scattered across the frozen countryside, each one glowing softly with candlelight, each one holding people wrapped in blankets, waiting for dawn and hoping for restoration. See in your mind's eye those linemen working through the night, climbing frozen poles with damaged hands, fighting exhaustion and cold to restore the connections that bring light back to darkness. Feel the contrast between their experience and yours, between their cold and your warmth, their darkness and your light, their uncertainty and your security. Let gratitude settle softly over you like snow, gentle and accumulating, for the simple gift of comfort that you possess in this moment. Be grateful for the heat that keeps you warm, for the lights that illuminate your space, for the invisible workers who maintain the systems that make your life possible. Be grateful for the infrastructure you never see, the maintenance that happens while you sleep, the constant vigilance that keeps disaster at bay. The ice has melted now years ago, leaving only memory and changed landscapes. The forests that became glass have returned to wood, though scarred and altered, growing back slowly into new configurations that bear the mark of that frozen winter. The people who lived through those dark days have mostly returned to normal life, taking for granted again the electricity that flows when they flip a switch, the heat that appears when they adjust a thermostat. But deep in their consciousness, something remains, a knowledge they can't quite forget, even as daily life pulls them back into comfortable routines. They know now, in a way that can't be unlearned, that all it takes is the right combination of conditions: temperature hovering near freezing, rain falling steadily for days, ice accumulating beyond design limits, and the entire modern world can pause. They've learned that civilization is far more fragile than anyone wants to believe, built on assumptions that nature can casually invalidate. They've seen what happens when the systems fail, when the infrastructure breaks, when the invisible support structure of modern life collapses under weight it was never meant to bear. And that knowledge creates a kind of gentle anxiety, a background awareness that comfort is conditional, that darkness is always possible, that the next storm might bring it all down again. But they've also learned something more hopeful, more essential. They've discovered that humans are resilient, remarkably so, capable of enduring conditions that seem impossible from the perspective of normal comfort. They've experienced how communities emerge in crisis, how shared hardship creates bonds that transcend the social divisions of ordinary life. They've witnessed how ordinary people become heroes simply by continuing to do their work under extraordinary circumstances, how kindness persists even when everything else fails. The storm was terrible, make no mistake about that. People died from the cold, from accidents on ice, from mistakes made in desperation. Properties were destroyed, livelihoods ruined, life savings lost. The economic damage ran into billions, and some individuals never fully recovered from what they lost in those frozen weeks. But the storm was also, in its strange way, a gift. It revealed truths about life that comfort obscures, about what really matters when everything else is stripped away, about human capacity for both vulnerability and strength, about the importance of community and connection in ways that prosperity makes invisible. It taught that the modern world, for all its marvels, rests on foundations that are not as solid as they seem. It demonstrated that nature still possesses power that dwarfs human capability, that weather can still halt civilization in its tracks, that ice accumulating at a steady rate can bring down everything humans have built. These are humbling lessons, uncomfortable lessons, but valuable ones. They create perspective, reminding us that we are not as separate from nature as modern life suggests, not as protected as technology promises, not as secure as comfort implies. Now, as you drift towards sleep, let these thoughts settle gently in your mind. Let them become part of the quiet awareness you carry into dreams, awareness of how fortunate you are, how temporary that fortune might be, how precious the ordinary miracles of heat and light truly are. Think of those people in their dark houses counting days without power, rationing food and fuel, wondering when relief would come. Think of the linemen with their cracked hands and exhausted bodies, climbing poles in brutal cold to restore connections. Think of the forests turned to glass, beautiful and dying, bearing weight they were never meant to carry. Hold all of this in your mind for just a moment and then let it go. Let it drift away like ice melting in spring, like morning fog burning off in sunlight. You are safe here in this moment. You are warm, or at least not dangerously cold. You have light if you need it, food within reach, water at the tap. You have shelter and security and all the accumulated comforts of modern life surrounding you like blankets, insulating you from the kind of cold and darkness that visited the Northeast in 1998. Let yourself feel grateful for these things without guilt, without the weight of those who have less. Gratitude doesn't require comparison. It can simply be appreciation for what is, for the good fortune of this particular moment in this particular place. As sleep comes, know that whatever storms might wait in the future, weather or otherwise, humans will endure them as they always have, with resilience and community, with kindness and determination, with the fundamental capacity to adapt and survive that has carried our species through every hardship. The ice storm taught this lesson above all others, that we are fragile but not breakable, vulnerable but remarkably strong, dependent on systems that can fail but capable of surviving even when they do. Rest now in this knowledge, in this quiet confidence that humans possess what they need to weather darkness and cold. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your muscles relax, one by one, releasing the tension they've been holding. Let your thoughts become less distinct, less urgent, drifting like snow falling in still air. Let the story of the ice storm, of cold and darkness, of beauty and survival, of hardship and human resilience fade into the background of your consciousness, becoming part of the gentle static that accompanies you into sleep. The storm is over now, has been over for more than 2 decades. The ice melted, the power returned, the world resumed its normal patterns. Life goes on as it always does, with its small comforts and daily rhythms, its accumulated miracles and forgotten infrastructure. And you, warm and safe in this moment, can rest, knowing that for tonight at least, the cold stays outside, the darkness is held at bay, and sleep can come gently, carrying you into dreams of spring and warmth, and the slow, steady return of light. Good night, traveller through time. Good night, witness to this frozen moment in history. May your sleep be deep and peaceful, undisturbed by cold or darkness. May you wake tomorrow grateful for warmth and light, for the simple miracles that make life comfortable and safe. And may you carry with you, somewhere in the back of your mind, the memory of those who endured the ice storm, their struggle and their strength, their cold nights and their eventual restoration, their quiet demonstration that humans can survive far more than we imagine together in the dark. Rest now. Let the story go. Let history fade into the gentle static of approaching sleep. You are here now, safe and warm, and that is enough. Sleep well.